This is Jacob Friedman. You might have laughed when you heard the news. I know a lot of people did. Donald Trump casually discussing the annexation of Greenland.
It feels absurd, archaic, something ripped from the age of imperial conquest rather than the 21st century. But if you were laughing, or if you rolled your eyes and scrolled past the headline thinking it was just another instance of Trump being Trump, another erratic, meaningless thought bubble floating out of the White House, you need to stop. You need to pay attention, because this isn't a joke. And the people who are actually responsible for the safety of the Western world are absolutely not laughing. If you want to understand the severity of this moment, you have to look away from the circus in Washington and look at what is happening quietly, urgently in the capitals of Europe. Specifically, you need to look at what Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was doing in Paris yesterday. On the surface, it looked like standard diplomacy, handshakes, photo ops, the polite choreographed dance of international relations. But if you listen closely to the language being used, and if you looked at the faces of the leaders standing next to him, you would have realized that these were not routine meetings. They were emergency talks. They were the frantic, necessary coordination of allies who have realized that the security umbrella they relied on for 75 years isn't just leaking, it is being actively dismantled by the very power that built it. What we are witnessing is the normalization of the unthinkable. In just a matter of days, we have watched the President of the United States launch military strikes in Venezuela, oversee the capture of a foreign head of state, and then, without pausing for breath, pivot to discussing the acquisition of a NATO territory protected by international law. Connect those dots. If Donald Trump can threaten Greenland today, he can threaten Canada tomorrow. That is no longer speculation. It is a pattern. It is a testing of boundaries. And the terrifying realization settling in across Europe and Ottawa is that the assumption many world leaders were still clinging to, the hope that Trump's words were just words, has been shattered. This is the hidden story that the mainstream media, with its obsession for the sensational, is largely missing. They are covering the Greenland purchase story as a gaffe or a real estate fantasy. They are asking if it's feasible. They are interviewing Danish politicians for outrage sound bites, but they are failing to ask the darker, more structural question. What happens to the concept of national sovereignty when the world's dominant military power decides that borders are negotiable? What happens to NATO when its most important member starts looking at its allies not as partners, but as potential acquisitions? This is why Mark Carney's presence in Europe is so critical, and why his tone has shifted so dramatically. Carney isn't there to charm the Europeans. He is there to stiffen their spines. He arrived in Paris for what were supposed to be routine diplomatic engagements, but the agenda was hijacked by reality. The conversation shifted immediately to alliance coordination and a growing, chilling realization that if the world doesn't respond together, no country is safe responding alone. This is the lesson of the last week. Isolation is fatal. When Carney appeared alongside the Prime Minister of Denmark, the visual itself was a manifesto. Greenland isn't a theoretical issue for Canada. We share the Arctic with them. We share a maritime border that stretches for 3,000 kilometers. We share NATO responsibilities in the high north. And perhaps most importantly, Canada understands that Arctic security is inseparable from its own sovereignty. If the rules don't apply in Nuuk, they won't apply in Iqaluit. Carney knows this, and he knows that in a world where the United States has gone rogue, Canada cannot afford to be a passive observer. The Prime Minister's words in Paris were striking for their lack of ambiguity. Usually diplomats speak in code. They use phrases like concerned or monitoring the situation. Carney didn't do that. He welcomed the Danish Prime Minister to this little corner of Canada in Europe, a reminder of the deep existential ties between the two nations. He spoke of the trading relationship, the diplomatic relationship, and the security relationship. But what mattered most wasn't the list of ties, it was the clarity of his stance. Carney made it explicit that Greenland's future belongs only to Greenland and Denmark, not to Washington, not to the White House, and certainly not to any external power looking to expand its footprint through coercion or cash. This wasn't just symbolic language. It was a line being drawn in the ice. It was Canada stepping into the vacuum left by the collapse of American moral leadership and saying no. You have to understand the context here. A year ago, Trump wasn't talking about Greenland. He was floating the idea of annexing Canada. He was calling us the 51st state. Back then, people laughed too. They thought it was bluster. But European leaders are now seeing what Canada saw then. Trump tests boundaries to see which ones hold. He pushes against the door of international law to see if it's locked. And if it's not, he walks right through. That is why Carney's tone in Europe was not casual. It was defensive, deliberate, and incredibly serious. When Carney was asked about the possibility of military force being used to annex Greenland, a question that frankly should be insane to even ask in 2026 regarding two NATO allies, he didn't get emotional. He didn't engage in the kind of Twitter baiting name-calling that defines American politics today. He went to the fundamentals. He spoke of self-determination. He spoke of territorial integrity. He spoke of the rule of law. He was asked point blank if he concurred with the Danish Prime Minister's assessment that any military move on Greenland would mean the end of NATO. His answer was a masterclass in diplomatic maneuvering that didn't give an inch on principle. He reiterated that the future of Greenland is a decision for the people of Greenland and Denmark exclusively. Exclusively. That word does a lot of heavy lifting. It shuts the door on any American pretension to ownership. But then he went further. He framed the issue not just as a Danish problem, but as a NATO problem. He talked about the western flank of NATO, which includes Greenland and the Canadian Arctic. He explicitly linked the defense of that territory to the evolving threat environment. That is polite diplomatic speak for, we know the Americans are becoming a problem. He talked about the need to invest more in defense, a point he has been stressing since he became Prime Minister. And he mentioned the buildup of Canada's military capabilities in the Arctic. This is the shift. This is the new reality. Canada is effectively rearming and reinforcing its northern border, not just against hostile powers like Russia or China, but to ensure that its sovereignty is respected by its closest neighbor. That is a profound psychological break from the last century of North American history. We are watching the architecture of the post-war world dissolve in real time, and we are watching Canada desperately try to build a new structure to replace it before the roof caves in. When a reporter pressed him on the fact that Stephen Miller, a senior advisor to President Trump, refused to rule out military force, Carney didn't take the bait. He didn't say he hadn't seen the comments to dodge the question. He used it to pivot back to first principles. Take a step back, he said. We are partners in NATO. It is a mutual defense alliance. He reminded the room and the world of the basic principles: self-determination, sovereignty, territorial integrity. These concepts, sovereignty, integrity, self-determination, used to be the boring bedrock of international relations. We took them for granted. We assumed they were settled. Now they are revolutionary demands. By anchoring Canada's position in these fundamentals, Carney wasn't just responding to a specific threat against Greenland. He was sending a warning to anyone watching. Annexation by force will not be tolerated, it will not be normalized, and it will not be excused. As the discussion continued, Carney expanded the frame even further. He made it clear that Greenland was not an isolated outpost. It is part of a collective responsibility. He linked the security of the Canadian Arctic directly to the security of the Nordic space. We are making progress within NATO, he said, but we have to do more. This is where the symbolism becomes vital. It wasn't enough for Carney to just say these things. He had to show them. And the most powerful image of this entire trip was Mark Carney standing shoulder to shoulder with the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte. Stop and look at that image in your mind. You have the Prime Minister of Canada and the head of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization standing together in Europe, essentially plotting how to secure the alliance against the erratic behavior of its largest member. It is an inversion of everything we were taught about how the world works. The United States is supposed to be the anchor of NATO. Now, the United States is the storm that NATO is trying to weather. Carney's language during this meeting was surgical. He introduced Root by praising his work at a critical time, noting the need to step up and have resources for not just today, but in the medium term for the new threat environment. That phrase, new threat environment, should send a chill down your spine. In diplomatic circles, you don't use words like that by accident. Usually, a threat environment refers to external enemies, terrorists, rogue states, rising authoritarian powers. But when the Prime Minister of Canada talks about a new threat environment while standing in Europe discussing the defense of Greenland, he isn't just talking about Russia. He isn't just talking about China. He is acknowledging, however politely, that the threat is now coming from inside the House. But watch how Carney handled this. A reporter asked him the obvious question: if Trump is going into Venezuela for oil, does that impact the Canadian oil sector? Does it change the calculus for pipelines? It was a trap, really. It invited Carney to either criticize Trump's illegal resource grab or to engage in a crass competition for market share. He did neither. Instead, he flipped the entire premise of the argument. He started by addressing the situation in Venezuela on its own terms, welcoming the prospect of a democratic transition and the removal of an illegitimate, corrupt regime. He kept the moral high ground, emphasizing that a functioning Venezuelan economy is good for the world. But then he pivoted, and this is the moment where the technocrat label that people like to slap on Carney fails to capture his political killer instinct. He didn't plead for Canadian oil. He didn't ask for favors. He simply stated facts that devastated Trump's logic without ever mentioning Trump's name. He laid out the case for Canadian energy competitiveness based on 3 pillars: low risk, low cost, and low carbon. Let's unpack that, because it is more than just an energy policy slogan. It is a geopolitical doctrine. When Carney says low risk, he is drawing a sharp, blinding contrast between Canada and the chaos Trump is unleashing. Venezuelan oil, even if Trump manages to seize it, is high risk. It is wrapped in conflict, instability, legal challenges, and the blood of a coup. It is dirty in every sense of the word. Canadian oil, by contrast, is produced under the rule of law. It is stable. It is reliable. By emphasizing low risk, Carney is telling the global market, do you really want to bet your energy security on a man who annexes territories on a whim? Or do you want to deal with a democracy that respects contracts and borders? He went further, bringing up the Pathways Alliance and carbon capture, framing Canadian resources as low carbon. This is crucial because it speaks to the European audience in a way Trump never can. Europe is desperate for energy, yes, but they are also legally and morally bound to their climate commitments. Trump offers them oil at the barrel of a gun. Carney offers them energy that fits into a decarbonizing world. He is effectively saying that Canada is the partner of the future, while Trump is peddling the plunder of the past. This brings us to the deeper layer of what is happening here. We are used to thinking of power in terms of brute force, who has the biggest army, who shouts the loudest. Trump embodies that view. He thinks power is the ability to take Greenland or seize Venezuela's oil fields. But Carney is wielding a different kind of power. It is the power of stability. It is the power of reliability. In a world that is becoming terrifyingly volatile, boring old Canadian stability is suddenly a strategic asset of immense value. Carney's meetings in Europe weren't just about preventing something bad from happening in Greenland. They were about presenting an alternative model of leadership. While Trump is breaking things, Carney is trying to show that the grown-ups are still in charge of the institutions that matter. He is leveraging Canada's reputation, our boring, polite, rule-following reputation, as a weapon against chaos. He is saying to Europe, you don't have to submit to the bully. You have options. You have allies. and we are right here. But we have to be honest about the limitations of this strategy. Carney is playing a high-stakes game of diplomatic chess against a man who has flipped over the board and is setting the pieces on fire. Rules and norms and low-risk assessments are powerful tools, but they only work if the other side cares about consequences. Trump does not. And that is the terrifying variable that no amount of smooth diplomacy can fully control. What happens if Trump decides that low risk isn't what he wants? What if he wants the conflict? What if the chaos is the point? Carney is building a coalition of the rational, but they are facing an irrational actor with the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. The system behind it that we need to look at here isn't just the NATO alliance or the global energy market. It is the collision of two fundamentally different worldviews. One view believes in a rules-based order where sovereignty is respected and trade is based on law. The other view believes that might makes right, and that the strong do what they can while the weak suffer what they must. Greenland is the flashpoint, but the fire is spreading everywhere. By linking the Arctic to Venezuela, Carney is showing us the map of this conflict. It is global. It touches every continent, and it forces every country to choose a side. You can't stay neutral when the rules of the game are being rewritten by force. Carney knows this. That's why he didn't stay in Ottawa. That's why he went to Paris. He knows that the defense of Canada doesn't start at the Canadian border anymore. It starts in the chancelleries of Europe, in the meeting rooms of NATO, and in the public refusal to accept the unacceptable. When Carney talks about the western flank of NATO, he is trying to wake people up. He is trying to make us see that the Atlantic Ocean is not a moat that protects us. It is a bridge that connects us to our only real safety net. If that net fails, if NATO crumbles because its members are too afraid to stand up to Washington, then Canada is alone. And a lone Canada next to a predatory America is a terrifying prospect. That is the nightmare scenario that Carney is working frantically to prevent. And this is where the who benefits and who pays calculation becomes stark. Who benefits from Trump's chaos? The autocrats, the strongmen, the leaders who want to grab territory without consequence. Who pays? The small nations, the democracies that rely on law rather than force, the people of Greenland who just want to live their lives without being purchased like real estate, the people of Venezuela who want democracy, not foreign intervention, and ultimately the people of Canada who are watching their closest friend turn into their biggest threat. Carney's strategy is to raise the cost of bad behavior. By coordinating with Europe, by engaging the NATO machinery, he is making it harder for Trump to act unilaterally. He is creating friction. He is putting speed bumps in the path of the tank. It might not stop the tank, but it slows it down. It buys time. And right now, time is the most valuable commodity we have. We are buying time for sanity to return. We are buying time for the institutions to hold. But let's not kid ourselves. The danger is real. The questions reporters were asking Carney about military force, about the end of NATO, were not hypothetical. They were the questions that define our time. And Carney's answers, as polished and reassuring as they were, revealed the gravity of the situation. He didn't say, that will never happen. He said, we need to invest more. He said, we need to be ready. That is the language of a leader who knows that the storm is coming and that the only thing we can do is brace for impact together. The era of comfortable Canadian isolation is over. The era of active, urgent defense has begun. And it began yesterday in a conference room in Paris. This is where we have to talk about the failure of the lens through which we are viewing this crisis. If you turn on cable news in the United States right now, you will see panels of pundits debating the feasibility of buying Greenland. They are discussing it like a real estate deal. They are bringing on economists to estimate the value of the island's mineral deposits and strategists to talk about shipping lanes. They are treating the potential annexation of a sovereign territory inhabited by indigenous people with their own government as a business proposition that just needs the right price tag. This framing isn't just shallow, it is complicit. It normalizes the grotesque. It takes a violation of international law and turns it into a bold proposal to be debated on morning television. Mark Carney is refusing to play that game, and that is why his intervention is so jarring to the American political ecosystem. He isn't engaging with the deal. He is rejecting the premise entirely. When he speaks about self-determination and sovereignty, he is using words that have been stripped of their meaning in the Trump era, and he is trying to inject them with power again. The media looks at Trump's threat and asks, can he do it? Carney looks at it and says, he must not do it. There is a world of difference between those two positions. One accepts the logic of the bully, the other confronts it. This media failure extends to how we talk about the Stephen Miller moment, when a senior White House advisor goes on television and refuses to rule out the use of military force against a NATO ally to secure a territorial acquisition. That should be the only headline in the world. It should stop the presses. It is a direct repudiation of Article 5. It is a signal that the United States is no longer a guarantor of peace, but a potential aggressor against its own friends. Yet, because it happened in the deluge of daily scandals, it barely registered as a blip. We are so exhausted, so flooded with outrage, that we have lost the ability to distinguish between a mean tweet and a threat of war. Carney knows this. He knows that the public's attention span is fractured. That is why he is bypassing the news cycle and going straight to the institutions. He is building a structure that can survive the fickleness of public opinion. By cementing Canada's position with Denmark and NATO leadership, he is creating a tripwire. If Trump moves, he isn't just moving against a small island. He is tripping a wire that rings bells in Ottawa, in Paris, in Brussels, and in London. It creates a diplomatic friction that makes impulsive action much harder to execute. But let's look at who actually pays the price for this kind of geopolitical vandalism. It is easy to think of Arctic security as an abstract concept involving icebreakers and satellite maps. But for the people who live there, for the Inuit communities in Greenland and in northern Canada, this is not abstract. It is existential. They are watching powers from the south treat their homeland as a chessboard. When Trump talks about getting the oil or strategic assets, he is erasing the people who live on top of those assets. He is reviving a colonial mindset that views the Arctic as empty space waiting to be conquered, rather than a home that demands respect. Carney's emphasis on working with our Nordic partners and his specific mention of the Nordic-Baltic Plus framework is a recognition of this human reality. These are nations that understand the Arctic not just as a resource frontier, but as a living environment. By aligning Canada with them, Carney is signaling that we stand with the people of the North, not with the empires that want to carve it up. It is a subtle but crucial distinction. He is positioning Canada as the defender of the Arctic way of life against the extractionist logic of the Trump administration. And this brings us to the system that is truly at stake here. We often talk about democracy as if it is just about voting. But democracy is also about the security of knowing that your borders are real, that your laws matter, and that your neighbor can't just decide to own you because they have a bigger bank account or a bigger army. When that certainty vanishes, democracy starts to wither. Fear takes over. Nations start making decisions based on survival rather than values. They start appeasing the bully because they are afraid of being next. We are seeing the early signs of this appeasement economy emerging globally, where countries rush to buy American weapons or sign unfair trade deals just to stay on Trump's good side. Carney is trying to break that cycle. He is showing that you don't have to appease. You can organize. You can stand on your own 2 feet. When he said we have to do more regarding NATO investments, he was admitting that the free ride is over. Canada can no longer outsource its security to the United States because the United States has become the source of insecurity. We have to pay for our own safety now. That is a hard truth for Canadians to swallow. We are used to being the peaceful neighbor who doesn't need a big stick. But Carney is telling us that the neighborhood has changed and we need to lock our doors. As we move toward the conclusion of this analysis, we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean for the future of the West If the West is split between the Trumpian urge for dominance and the Carney European urge for cooperation, can it survive? Or are we watching the bifurcation of the democratic world into two camps, the predators and the partners? Carney's trip suggests that the split has already happened. We are building a life without the assumption of American protection. And that, more than any specific threat to Greenland, is the historic shift that will define the next generation of Canadian life.